Hello, welcome to McKinley. As we migrate towards freight movements and all these things, getting uncoupling to work is paramount. Here's our journey. When we first started off, there were Lima, there were Bachmann, Mainline and Hornby, and they all had very, very different coupling tools. Remember the big Lima D rings? And the wagons were so far apart, it looked incredibly unrealistic. So we went about the process of hacking off all those couplings and going to this American system called KD, because they had short and long coupling levers, they had knuckles that were above, center and below, the lever arms, so the knuckle heads could be adjusted. So it seemed like a bit of it was a technical challenge to get there, but it seemed like to us at the time we could solve things. We built up massive lists of how to convert a mainline 12-ton wagon, a well wagon, a drop this, a this and that, and we had big lists of which couplings to choose from in the KD family, which length they had to be, how you fix them to either the body or to a bogie. And that all was going quite well. It was very laborious, but we managed to get things to behave. Then the NEM pocket came out, and the manufacturers like Bachmann and at some stage Hornby started to adopt some of their models into that framework. KD produced an NEM socketed coupling, the NEM, so they had the 18, 19s and 20s. I think there's even a 17, but that doesn't work in the UK. So in theory that was great, wasn't it? Except that it isn't, because the pockets that the manufacturers put on their engines are not NEM compliant. The Bachmann Mark I coaches are too high. The Bachmann Class 40s, the pocket isn't really NEM, it's too short and it's too floppy, so the KD coupling sits and flops inside it. It doesn't work well, and you have to find all kinds of techniques to prop things up. I'm not picking on Bachmann specifically here. Dapple on their wheels. If you want to shunt wagons in yards with code 100 track, don't buy Dapple wagons, or do, and then replace all the wagon wheels with Bachmann ones. So all the manufacturers don't really pay attention to any of the standards that are really crucial to this kind of stuff. When you look at the reviews of wagons and coaches, none of them never qualify to say, oh, this engine will pull this up a slope, or the back-to-backs are good, or the NEM pockets are appropriately sized. No one ever reviews the technical stuff. It's almost like we're sold toys, and then actually you've got to then adapt them to become miniature engineering stuff, which is what model railways need. 0.1 of a millimetre on the back-to-backs being wrong will derail a wagon on a crossing. So it's a challenge. Anyway, I'll stop the griping. So what I've got here is our first versions alike, where we're using static KD magnets embedded into the track. And I've got this one down here, and we're just going to recap how those work, what the downside of them is for us, and where we still use them. This is a permanent magnet made by KD that sits in between the tracks. And if I was to push this rake of wagons on here, and I intend to uncouple these two triplets from each other, it's quite a straightforward operation in one sense. So there it uncouples perfectly, and then you can also have the trick of pushing that train back in and then pulling the train forward, and they don't couple up. And that was always one of the quotes advertised features of KD. And if you then go back in there again and pick it up and then pull the train out, it will automatically couple up. What we found though to be a problem with these permanent magnets is if there was a judder in the train, it would leave the train. Now I've manually forced a judder, but we would often find that having permanent magnets in the track would leave half the train behind because of some connection problem with the locomotive. Permanent magnets still have some significant benefits, and we're using them at specific locations. Let me show you how we're using them in London. In our London terminus, at the end of the platforms, we have 4 permanent magnets close, butted up to each other to form a continuous array of uncouplers. And the idea of these is that it will cope with any length of locomotive, be it a class 40 diesel or a small steam locomotive. They will all pull their train in, and it will effectively allow the KD coupling between the locomotive and the coaches, or the locomotive and the parcels vans, to become uncoupled. And we'll show you now with a locomotive pulling a train in and then another shunting engine pulling it out. I shall now bring in a pilot locomotive into the end of the platform and couple up to the coaches. By coupling up, it will release the pressure on the KD couplings between the locomotive and the first carriage, which should allow them to spring open and the pilot locomotive to tow the carriages back out. The next iteration we went on to was using electromagnets like this. We mounted them above the tracks, and there's an interesting journey there because in Sheffield they're above the tracks like this, and in Wakefield they're beneath the tracks. I'll cover that in more detail a bit later. So the challenge, they work well, things don't uncouple unnecessarily because these aren't permanently charged like a static magnet, but the real challenge with any of these things is getting everything lined up and having the right movement. And typically that involved the process of positioning the wagon somewhere close to the start of the middle of the magnet, then pressing that, then changing the locomotive direction, pressing that, and then starting it off in the opposite direction. As you can see, when I press the magnet, it pulls the uncouplings. If I was to manually move that train in here, you'll see them both being flung apart. So that's great, but it requires great manual dexterity with buttons in one hand and throttles and directions of locomotive in the other. So we had to think of something a little bit neater. I'm not sure which idea stroke invention came first, but we certainly discovered that the ESU chips that we standardized on had what we would call the uncouple shuffle, which was that you could tell the locomotive to push back at a certain speed for so long, pause, and then pull away at a different speed and for a different length of time. If I show you now, I pressed a function key and it does the shuffle. It does nothing more than if I were to, let's position that here, and position that triplet over the uncoupler there. That achieves the same thing, and I had to just press 2 buttons, but I still had to have my hand pressed on the button with this. So let's go and look at Sheffield now for the next iteration of this. Here we are in Sheffield, and here's the next generation of uncoupler buttons. When I press this button here, it energizes the uncoupler for a fixed 5-second period, and it flashes in the meantime. So I haven't got to hold my hand on it I just press it once and let go. So if you look up, it energizes the electromagnet for 5 seconds, which forces the KD coupling open. So now we're going to use the same 2 triplets and shunter that we're showing in Birmingham and London to come over the electromagnet here. And what I'm going to do is bring it into the siding and position it over the beginning of the uncoupler. I'm going to change direction for the locomotive. I'm going to press F3, the function key we've assigned to the uncouple shuffle on the shunter. That will push the wagons back, compress the coupling, and once I press the button F3 on the locomotive, I'll then press this. So I start there and I start there, and it comes undone. And that works really quite reliably. So far, what we've described is how we can use the uncouple shuffle to uncouple wagons and the like, or even the shunter if you like, by moving it over an electro uncoupler built underneath the track. One thing we wanted to do was be able to uncouple wagons from the shunter at any point in time. And in one of our earlier videos, we were showing how we had built this ingenious piece of solenoid. Then the problem was it would burn out and all these kind of things. And some bright spark, who I'm very grateful for by the way, said, have you seen this little motor that comes from Precimodels? And it pulls and it adapts the KD coupling on the shunter and pulls it open with a little string. And with the aux key that we assign it to, with the ESU chips we use, we can say delay for a certain number of seconds because it's built in with the shuffle, then pull it back for a specific number of seconds and then let go so that it doesn't overcook the motor that's being driven on aux 1 or aux 2 on the shunter, because we have these little circular motors underneath each end on our 08s and steam shunters. So let me show you how that's working in detail. With this engine, we want to be able to uncouple just anywhere. So I pulled that same 2 triplets of wagons out from the siding, and simply by pressing the extended version of the uncouple shuffle, which also links to these special Preci motors, and if I press F6 now, it pushes back, pulls back the uncoupling, and the engine moves away. Having seen the uncouple shuffle working directly from the shunter so that it can uncouple itself directly from any sets of wagons at any point in the layout, what we're going to do now is look at this from the underside up in a cradle and watch these things being triggered so you get an idea of how the motor works. With the sister shunter in this cradle, we've unlinked the shuffle from the uncouple, and here you can see the motor is on a simple little tiny piece of cord that links to the KD. There's one at this end and there's one at the other end, but they're hidden by the connections to the track power. So what I'm going to do now is hit the function key and you'll see this move. And then go back. The delay in it moving, let me do it one more time. The delay in it moving is because this has been programmed to shuffle backwards, then pull back, and then release. So the auxiliary functions in the chip protect the motor from being burned out. That's quite crucial because these things are coreless, and you'll do a lot of damage to either the motor or the chip if they were left on. So it has to be a smart chip to do it, but this gives us the flexibility we need. So the only challenge we really have in life is trying to get the KDs at exactly the right height, and that's a mission. To help our operators understand which button to press, we've gone back to the tried and trusted technique that we've been using with the control panels, and we will have cut out mechanisms in the front of this fascia plate with a colorized section and the track name above it, and this will sit down here where these 3 buttons are there. the buttons will be bolted on. This will be screwed to the fascia, which this is the temporary fascia right now, but it will be very clear to operators which button operates which uncoupler. If we take a look at the uncoupler assembly, we have two versions here. One is up and above and between the rails and above the sleepers, as we have in Sheffield, and then here is one that we assembled beneath the sleepers, which is how James has built them for Wakefield. What we found was that the ones up here needed a 15-volt DC power supply to trigger them and make them work reliably. But when you move the magnet further away from the track and the KD metal, you needed to raise that voltage to 18 volts. This assembly board was used for us to test using RFID and see how close we could get it to the uncoupler before it started to get interfered with. The great news was that our train tracking system didn't seem to mind whether these things almost abutted. They weren't affected, which was great news. So let's have a look at the rear of this now. On the rear, here is the KD electromagnet. What we have here is the smart little board that goes into the power supply that was built by Hart, and linked to it with a little 4-core cable is the button that Ian also supplies, and it's these two clever things here that he built us to give our operators flexibility in not having to hold a button down. Ian's details will be in the Show More tab associated with this video. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative. It shows the journey we've undertaken here at McKinley with our uncouplings and our couplings and all these things. And you're up to date with where we're at. So the proof is going to be in the pudding. We're about to start running this extension with freight and shunting wagons backwards and forwards. I'm sure there'll be more to see and we'll find things out, but who knows? Stay tuned.